I'm going to be talking through my scheme of work, the rationale behind it, and then making specific reference to three specific learners, Molly, Sean, and Noah. So the context behind my scheme of work is that I'm going to look to develop the almost a holistic outline of sport, focusing on the technical, tactical, social, physical, and cognitive aspects. So obviously it's a lot to cover within 6 weeks. So even though there'll be a key theme each week, the idea is that we'll still be drawing upon previous aspects and trying to build sequentially from the previous lessons rather than it appearing like 6 individual lessons. So my context is that they are Year 7 learners. From a prior learning perspective, in my experience of teaching tennis, kids come into it at from all different stages. Some kids have played before, some kids have never held a racket. So for that reason, prior learning, as long as they can throw and catch with some degree of accuracy, this is going to help when it comes to drills that involve feeding or even rallying and understanding the difference between putting a lot of force onto a throw or a swing and putting a little bit of force onto a throw or swing. So as long as they can throw or feed to some degree of accuracy, they'd probably pick this up from other throwing or catching sports, and hopefully we can transfer a little bit of that and build on it in tennis. In terms of the resources, as well as traditional rackets and tennis nets and balls, also want to make sure that there are different size balls available, some which are visually easier to see, hold and throw. Hula hoops as well, in case we've not got enough rackets, or even if we have got enough rackets, we can still keep both learners involved, because we can have games where, for example, students aim to get the ball through the hoop, and more advanced learners can actually aim to hit the ball. So both students have a go at being able to coordinate the swing, but you get double the amount of learning. Also want access to iPads if possible, so that students who can't physically participate can still be involved in coaching or the analysis and evaluation side of things, as well as mini whiteboards for any AFL tasks. Ideally, we'd have easily adjustable tennis nets, so because in my experience, one of the things students who lose tennis struggle with the most is simply getting the ball over the net. So by having lower tennis nets or even no tennis nets, we can easily navigate this issue. So going into the overall lesson plan, as I said, by the end of it, as long as they can understand that tennis is a game in which you outwit an opponent and be able to show examples, either verbally or physically, of how you might do that. From a technical perspective, a basic understanding of forehand and backhand shots, not worrying too much about the serve for now. And from a physical perspective, being able to get back into a ready position and always be in a position to play a decent shot. And from a social and moral perspective, understanding how to officiate a game and understanding elements of basically adhering to fair play and why that's important in sport, and the aspects that we can draw on in and outside of sport. And finally, the ability to peer assess and provide feedback for partners. So diving into this a little bit more specifically, so the way I've ordered the scheme of work is that lesson 1 is going to be on reading and reacting to the game, because we can probably draw on transferable skills from other sports. And then secondly, just getting into basic rallying, so an understanding of what it feels like to generally tap the ball, and an understanding of how much force and finesse is required with hitting the ball. And then we can go into outwitting an opponent once we've developed the skills to be able to effectively orientate our body to receive the ball and send it back. And then we can start talking about tactics once students have that technical base of a variety of skill shots. In the 4th lesson, we'll look at officiating. In the 5th lesson, once we've covered the ability to send and receive the ball in different ways and to reposition our body in order to help us do this, then we can start talking about strengths and weaknesses, and finally finish with some variation of gameplay. So although it seems quite technical and physically orientated, we'll use stuff like beanbags, Swiss balls, and stuff that's just generally going to make it easier, as long as they understand the key concepts. So from a reading and reactive perspective, as long as they're able to get into an athletic ready position, which they should be able to develop from other sports, and always be in a position to effectively coordinate the stroke, whether that's using a beanbag, a Swiss ball, or a proper tennis ball. In lesson 1, Sean, who's the learner with a back brace, is going to be given an iPad, and he's always going to be shared. The lesson plan will always be shared with him in advance, so that should he need to take a break, his job is going to be to film other learners with a specific reference to the focus of that day. So lesson 1, we're just going to focus on being able to always be in a position to hit the ball. And for example, for elite learners, we can start talking about the nuances of tennis, such as adding, such as returning to the baseline, or being able to move around the court, whereas for beginners, this is just simply, are they in a decent ready position, and are they focusing on what's actually happening? In the second lesson, we're going to get into basic rallying. So obviously this is building on the ability to always be in a good position to hit the ball and to beat the bounce of the ball. For the bronze learners, this might simply be coordinating a stroke action using a beanbag, or even a Swiss ball, just to give them more time to get in position, or a foam ball. Whereas for the higher ability learners, this might be looking at covering all parts of the court using a variety of strokes, so that they're rallying from different parts of the court and covering all parts of the court. Whereas for the lower ability learners, this might simply be giving them maximum exposure to shots rather than constantly grabbing the ball and picking it up because they've hit the net. Again, we develop the ability to build up a rally from a cooperative perspective, as in students are trying to help each other rather than beat each other, and with the link back to the key theme of this scheme of work, which is outwitting an opponent. And one of the best ways to outwit an opponent is to hit the ball back one more time than they do. So a rally is our sort of key construct to that theme. Once we've built up this idea of always being in a position to hit the ball and executing a shot to build up a basic rally, then we can start to talk about outwitting an opponent. So for most students, the outwitting an opponent will literally be returning the ball once more than they do. And this is where having different net heights accessible is going to give students more of a chance to practice the skill, rather than being almost inadvertently excluded by the fact they can't get the ball over the net. We can look at target practice, so now we can get students thinking about where the target should be and can they actually hit them. And we can focus on hitting these targets with a variety of different implements in a variety of different ways. So for example, the high ability students might be hitting a wide forehand with topspin, whereas low ability students might be throwing a beanbag towards a large target using a basic forehand technique. And once we've into lesson 4, now we're starting to bring in elements of fair play. So it doesn't necessarily have to look like tennis. It can just simply be about following the rules of the game. So this is something that I'm a big advocate of, because I think sport is a great teacher of just rules of life in general. So even though the know and understand is for them to know and understand the basic laws of the game, that could be whatever variation of games we've previously covered. So it might not be appropriate or fun and entertaining for kids who can barely get the ball over the net to practice serving on the doubles court. They might be doing a variation of floor tennis where the ball doesn't have to bounce, or Mexican tennis where it can have unlimited bounces, but it's about being fair, being honest. So we might play about with distorting the game somewhat, so it's more fair to other students or less fair to, for example, high ability students. So we can still challenge and stretch those students in a way that's appropriate to them, whilst discussing elements of sportsmanship, gamesmanship, playing within the rules, and the importance of doing so. In the penultimate lesson, we can talk about strengths and weaknesses, so bringing together elements of previous lessons and getting students to understand how their development in relation to tennis is in relation to a technical, tactical, physical, and social and moral perspectives. And finally, the lesson theme of the last lesson is going to be about gameplay variation. So again, this doesn't have to be traditional doubles or singles. In fact, it's less likely to be, because the aim is still on maximising the amount of touches they get and the chances they get to develop their ability to outwit an opponent. So it's probably going to look like different variations of games. rather than traditional tennis per se. However, if we've got some more high ability students, then seeing them demonstrate their skills in a match play scenario could be appropriate for these learners. So again, there's a variety of different games, and I'm now going to go over the specific aspects of this in relation to 3 learners that we've been asked to focus on for the sake of this task. So I'm just going to pause the video there. So now I'm going to talk through the learners in specific detail. So what I've done here is map out an overview of what I feel that the learners need. And the 3 learners, the main key points are that with an EAL student, we're going to make sure that anything that is said verbally can also be demonstrated visually, whether this is through task cards, whether this is through making sure that this student can see a quality demo, whether this is making sure that we've got means, even if it's just hand signals, of verifying whether or not they understand, or even physically monitoring or helping the student during this, making sure that the groupings are considered. So for example, Noah is with pupils who are going to be patient and considerate and also help her. Making sure that Sean knows the expectations of him, that just because he is in a back brace, has poor vision and can't use his right arm, he's still going to be involved in the lesson as much as possible. Ideally, we'd like to keep him physically involved where possible, whether this is using bean bags, whether it's using brighter balls, whether it's using balls that are slower to help him. Sharing the lesson plan with Sean in advance so that he knows what's expected of him, which court he's going to be on, he can get there earlier if he needs to, giving him ample time to practice. And with Molly, differentiating through role, so perhaps giving her a task, depending on advice from Masenko, that either necessitates social interaction on some sort of level, but easing her in. So for example, being in charge of her group's equipment, or whether it's simply trying to get her more involved, or minimizing the stress levels for her by giving her task cards, briefing her ahead of the lesson about what's going to be expected of her. So where possible, anything that can be spoken is going to be made visual. So task cards for Noah and for Molly, these task cards will contain minimum words, might contain wording in Arabic if appropriate for Noah, whereas for Sean, he's going to have the iPad available. He's going to be able to film parts of the session. He's going to be given specific tasks to do. So I'm just going to scroll past this now and show what this looks like within the context of the lesson. So for example, on the lesson on reading and reacting, if Sean can't physically read and react, then he's going to be looking at the extent to which his peers adopt the ready position, how consistent are they in doing so, helping coach pupils. He's also going to be filming on an iPad, so when we get to the strengths and weaknesses lesson, each pupil is going to be able to have a homework task where they can be sent videos of their match play or their performance in the lesson so far, so they themselves can come to the lesson having had a think about what they think their strengths and weaknesses are. So here's another task where, for example, Sean could take on a performance analysis type of role, identifying the extent to which pupils use certain movement patterns and discussing the potential importance of this. So again, he's going to get arguably even more knowledge than pupils who are practically involved in the lesson. But as I said, where possible, Sean will try to be kept physically active, where we're using equipment, for example, a low net or no net at all, foam balls, objects that move slower, to try and keep him physically active where possible. We can use different court sizes as well to ensure that students aren't simply just chasing after the ball. So when it comes to outwitting an opponent, again, Sean can adopt a performance analysis or coaching type role where he can be specifically looking for these things in a little bit more detail. He can be recording, and this can always be used to help students with their strengths and weaknesses when we get into later lessons. In terms of Noah, I deliberately tried to keep the task cards with minimal or without English at all, using hand signals, as this, depending on his level of English, this may be more useful for him, making sure he can see a demonstration, making sure he knows the rules of the game, even if he can't necessarily articulate this himself. For Molly, or even for Sean, having visuals of these task cards. For Sean, the rules are on there. For Molly, it's just trying to be as visual as possible without necessarily overwhelming her with the words. For someone like Sean, he might be able to officiate better than other pupils because he might have time to look at the nuances between the rules, or he could be on Hawkeye duty where he is in charge of filming the game, and then we can use this as a resource to discuss the lesson or to discuss specific aspects of scoring in more detail. With Noah, I've decided, for example, for the lesson where they've got to evaluate strengths and weaknesses, to try and make it completely pictures to start with, depending on his level of English. I've assumed it's pretty low. And just as a starting point of him recognizing who does what well, what does he do well. This emoji type strategy is something that I've seen used in other lessons for lower ability learners, tends to be more engaging than overwhelming them with words. When it comes to which player pupil strengths and weaknesses, try to make this interactive. So for example, Sean might see the visual of the player, and I've tried to represent certain qualities that we've gone over, such as the ability to be a good sportsman, being technically efficient, being physically dominant, etc. So this might also be a good way of giving someone like Molly, who doesn't like interaction, some sort of scaffolding, if you will, to give her a talking point. I feel like I'm good at this. Maybe I need to work on that. And these are just some examples of that. And finally, the gameplay variations. As I said, in week 6, what you might have a high ability student doing, the variation of game they use compared to, for example, someone like Sean, where he might be sending and receiving a beanbag or a sponge football. Doesn't really matter as long as the key aspects of the technique are there, and as long as he is able to participate in the lesson on some kind of level. So making sure that we've got differentiated equipment, we can use different space within the court, we can provide a different role, but anything that's going to make the learning accessible, anything that's going to make the learning more visual for Noah and Molly, and briefing all these students in advance, working alongside more experienced teachers who have gained experience with these students and found successful strategies with them. Thank you for listening. Any questions? Thank you very much.